Welcome to Maddie's Insights webcast series. I'm Dr. Sheila Segerson, Director of Shelter Solutions at Maddie's Fund. Maddie's Insights are webcasts that share practical tips based on current research to help pets and people, and that you can use at your organization. Our guest today is Seana Dowling-Guyer. Seana is the Associate Director of Tufts Collaborative for Shelter Dogs at Cummings School of Veterinary Medicine at Tufts University and teaches in the Masters in Animals and Public Policy program. Seana will be talking to us today about her research that looked at aligning dog retention programs with community needs. Let's welcome Seana to learn more. Good to see you, Seana.
Hi, yes, and I thank you so very much, Sheila and Maddie's Fund for inviting me here. I'm really excited to be here and talk about this research project and what it might mean and how you might use that information at your organization. So I am going to share my screen now. So just what I want to cover today is an overview of the research. Talk a little bit with you about limitations and key takeaways. And then I'd like to take a little bit at the end, a little bit of time at the end to connect this research with the real world and talk a little bit more about how to align our community programs to support pet retention with community needs. And then hear a little bit from you about your thoughts about next steps and information you would like. And of course, some Q&A at the end. I'm really delighted to be here to talk about this study, Community Programming for Companion Dog Retention, a survey of animal welfare organizations. And I'd like to give a shout out to my co-authors, Amanda Russo, who was a student in the Masters in Animals and Public Policy program at Cummings Vet School, and then went on back to sheltering, and Dr. Emily McCobb, who is the director of Tufts School Shelter Medicine program and assistant director of the Center for Animals and Public Policy, but she is now at University of California, Davis Vet School in an amazing new position focused on access to care issues. So stay tuned for amazing things from her. This is a link, and the link is in the chat. Thank you, Allison, where you can access it. It may be that you can only see the abstract, but if you're interested in the full article, I am looking at posting it up to a gathering website like ResearchGate, where you can access that. So we'll keep you posted on that, and we'll post that link in the Maddie's Forum when that comes around. Okay, so I want to give you a little background for the rationale. Way back in 2014, we were looking at the trends in animal sheltering, looking at how pet ownership was continuing to increase, more people, more pets. More people adding pets to their homes. And yet, in good news, there were in a lot of places in the country, their shelter and rescue populations were declining, mainly due to some very effective spay-neuter services, but other factors as well. And really, the field of sheltering was starting to have conversations about what will sheltering look like in the future? Do we need shelters? What will we be doing? And the focus was shifting to looking in the community and getting services and support resources directly to pet owners who maybe were struggling with issues keeping their pet or maintaining their pet or providing for their pet. So as these trends developed in 2015, we were really starting to talk to shelters and rescues more and to folks and hearing more about what they thought their communities needed and what programs they were implementing. And what we noticed was it was sort of all over the place. There were a whole lot of ideas, a whole lot of programs, different programs. Some seem to be wildly successful and some not so much. Some seem to take a lot of effort and resources and money, and some not as much. And we started to feel like it was very uneven, a little bit of a scattershot approach. And so we started to have questions about, well, what is going on? What are the trends? What programs are sheltering organizations offering? And how did that meet the needs in the community? What was really helpful? So in 2015, we launched this survey, and it's a survey focused on shelters and rescues. So it's from their perspective. But we were asking, what programs have you offered? What is being used? Where are you going with this? So, and sometimes you might hear these called safety net programs. So this is a big point to notice is this data is older data. These data are from 2015. It took about 4 years after that to finish the data collection, finish the analysis, writing, submitting to a journal, revising, resubmitting, going through stages. There were life events of the authors where had long stretches of not a lot of progress. So this is probably an excessively long period to get published, but it was accepted and published online in 2020. However, then it later received a 2021 print publication year, and that was later revised to 2023 as the printed journals, well, as the paper journals were printed and mailed out. So the year of publication is technically 2023, but I just call your attention to the fact that the results themselves are from 2015. So you might think, why are we talking about this? That is old data. How is that relevant? Well, there's still a lot to learn from this information from that period. But yeah, we do have to be aware that a lot of things in the world changed since 2015, a little thing called COVID, and among other things. And things in the sheltering world have changed a lot. So that is a caveat, but there's still a lot of value in looking. This might be a pre-COVID baseline for what was happening. And I think there's a lot to learn from the process of going through this research and thinking about what this might mean, that is still translatable to now. All right, so again, the rationale, we really didn't know a lot about what the trends were in the country as a whole, what programs were being offered, what did we think was helping. So the purpose of the study was to look at what are the needs and programs out there offered by U.S. sheltering organizations to help owners who are considering relinquishing their pet. And another important point is this is from the sheltering perspective. We didn't go into a community. We didn't talk to pet owners and ask them what issues. There is a fair amount of research on that. Still more we can do. But this is really from the sheltering perspective. What did the folks working and volunteering in sheltering think was going on? And we were particularly interested in trends by the type of organization. As a shelter with a municipal contract, a municipal agency, a rescue, as well as across different regions in the U.S., because we know pet ownership and shelter intakes vary a lot in different regions of the country. So, we felt like this was worthwhile to do. We would learn something not only about the different programs, but what might be working and what might be working in different communities. And then we can use that to better develop programs or to develop better programs and to evaluate whether those programs are working or not. All right, so what did we do? This was an online survey of U.S. sheltering organizations which accepted dog surrender. So they had to accept dogs for surrender from owners to participate, to be eligible to participate. They didn't actually have to offer programs, but they had to accept dogs from owners as owner surrenders. We used a convenience and snowball sampling method. We shared invitations with links in Humane Society's The Scoop newsletter and on Pet Point's homepage. Thank you, HSUS, and thank you, Pet Health Pet Point. As well as sending out a flurry of emails to our contacts in sheltering and then asking them to share with their contacts. That was the snowball part of things. Oop. Hold on. There we go. All right, so participants had to work or volunteer at a shelter or rescue which accepted owner relinquished dogs, and they had to have knowledge of the surrenders to their organization and knowledge of the retention programs if there were any. But as I mentioned, there was no requirement for the organization to actually offer these programs. And another important point is participants are representing their organization. So they are there sharing information about the procedures, protocols, information at their organization, not so much their own personal opinion. And because this was going out in various places across the country, we could have had duplicate responses from a single organization. So we did ask organization name and dedupe those so that we only had one person per one organization. In the end, it was only one person. There was only one duplicate response. So we had 332 respondents, and that was reduced, though, to 111 participants after we excluded incomplete surveys and ineligible participants. You can see 60% held the title of president or shelter director or manager. So definitely people who were aware of the trends and practices at their organization. They had been at their organization for a fair amount of time, 8.1 years on average, and had been in animal welfare 12.5 years. Not surprisingly, most of the sample was women, and most of the sample were 40 to 59 years old, which I think probably represents sheltering on average. All right. So then for the questionnaire, we asked a mix of closed and open-ended questions. It took about 20 minutes to respond, so people really hung in there. But participants could pause and then return to the survey later if they needed to. We asked questions in certain sections. We asked certainly eligibility and demographics. We asked about their dog population, intake relinquishments, surrenders. We asked perceived reasons for relinquishments, what programs they had and planned to implement, resources that they thought would help the most, and any challenges for running those programs. All right. So then somehow my builds here have gone a little awry, but that's fine. So what did we find out? First of all, we looked at who responded by organization, and we found we had a mix where 38% were private shelters with a physical building, 34% were private shelters with a physical building and a municipal contract. And we did pull those out separate. I'm sure most of you are aware, when a shelter has a municipal contract, that really is some of the protocols and the volume of animals they take in. So we felt that was important to pull those folks out separate. 17% were municipal organizations with a physical building, and 11% were private rescues, which did not have a physical building. It was pretty much how everybody fell out. For the region, it really got a decent spread across the country, with most coming from the South, followed by the Northeast, smaller number from the Midwest, and then 21% from the West. And 75% of the participants were from an organization which only had one location. All right, so we asked some questions about some more questions about the organization to understand how long they've been around and how large they were in terms of employees or volunteers. You can see here that the organizations with a physical building, the shelters with a physical building, or the municipal, have been around for a while. Median age was 45 years, whereas the rescues had been around were a lot younger, a median of 8 years. For employees, it ranged from 12 to 20 for the shelters and agencies with a building, and the private shelters with a physical building and municipal contracts were the largest. And whereas, not surprisingly, rescues on the median number of paid employees was 0. That doesn't mean some of those rescues didn't have paid employees, but so few did that the median was 0. But for volunteers, you can see much larger numbers. We know sheltering really relies on our beloved volunteers, and the private shelters with physical building and municipal contracts had vastly more volunteers than anyone else. 17% of our participants were at organizations which only had volunteers, no paid employees. All right. Let's look at our dog numbers here. This is a figure that shows the median number of dog intakes, surrenders, and adoptions by organization type and by region. So if we look at the top, you can see that I have to move my thing around here. My Zoom panel's around. That in the South, Southern organizations took in a lot more dogs than organizations in any region. Consequently, they had a lot more adoptions. And in the Northeast, they had fewer, smaller numbers and fewer surrenders as well. By type, you can see that there was some variety with but the municipal organizations and the private organizations with the municipal contracts also had higher numbers. Interestingly, we pulled out a subsample of 79 participants who had complete data for intake, surrenders, and adoptions. And we ran some numbers and found out that about 35.6% of their dog intakes were from surrenders. And there was an average of 66.7% of those dogs who were adopted. So that kind of gives us a feel for the size of the surrendered population of dogs, as well as where they went after that. All right. We did ask about their protocols for intake. 69% always or sometimes required intake appointments, with those most likely to be rescues, as well as organizations in the Northeast. This is one of those that I suspect this number has changed a lot, both during COVID and post-COVID. So that would be something that would be interesting to look at again. And most organizations had some kind of foster care. The least likely to use foster care were municipal shelters, which is often due to legal restrictions within a city or town. All right, so we asked participants what were the reasons for dog surrenders at their organization. And again, a note that this is their perceived, these are their perceptions, the perceived reasons, because we didn't have them collect and give us their actual shelter data. We asked, it's kind of more of a gut check. So take that, keep that in mind. There's some caveats there, but you can see moving represented was the most frequently cited reason for surrender, followed by financial difficulties, landlord restrictions, which is a little bit different than moving, behavior, and then not having enough time or a change in the family. Not as many people, many fewer participants said health issues or conflicts with other pets. And we know they could check multiple options here. So it's a multiple response question, but we know surrender reasons can be very complicated and multifaceted. So often there are 2 or 3 reasons for a surrender reason. So we know this is probably an oversimplification, but it was an interesting gut check on what our participants were saying were contributing factors for relinquishment. All right, so then we asked, well, what resources would be the most helpful to owners in your community? And again, these are their perceptions of what would be the most helpful. You can see high numbers indicated behavior training or obedience classes or behavior consultations. funds for vet care at any organization. So it was like kind of a charity fund, an angel fund, something like that. Free or low cost vet care, rehoming advice on the website, and then free or low cost spay neuter services and food banks. All of those were selected by over 50% of the participants. Again, it's a multiple response question, so they could pick multiple options here. Telephone helplines and advice on the website, in particular, were not seen as very helpful by our sample. All right, so then we asked, okay, well, what programs does your organization offer, and which are the most used at your organization if you do offer that program? So if you look just first at the blue bars, you can see this range from 20% for free or low-cost vet care at their organization, all the way up to 63% of organizations offering a food bank. So this is a lower cost, less resource intensive program. This is much more intensive program. So that's, not a big surprise there. What is particularly interesting, you have some of these surrender counseling, rehoming advice on the website. These three are lower, fewer resources are needed, less intense programs. But then you get to spay neuter services, behavior consultations, behavior training. So those are more, and then of course a fund, more intensive. When you contrast that with what was the most used, you see some big, what I would say are gaps here. So for example, few organizations offered free or low-cost vet care at the organization, not surprisingly, but when it was offered, it was seen as being highly used. Similarly, for spay neuter services, many more organizations offered, and these are percentages, free or low cost spay neuter services, but when it was offered, a lot more, our participants felt a lot of people were using it. 77% said it was one of the most used programs. So again, that might be a little gap there to look at. Versus food banks, 63% of organizations, it was the most popular program offered, and the 60% said it was one of the most used programs. Here we have behavior consultations, 36% were offering it, but only 21% said it was the most, a very used program. So that's an interesting gap in the other direction, what's going on there versus behavior training or obedience classes. So, I think it's interesting, the combination of these two questions. It's not just about offering the program, it's about it being used. And then certainly down the road, it would be helpful to know what was effective, what really helped. If we had another bar chart on there, that would really give us some helpful information to understand and triangulate on this idea of what programs are the most helpful and needed in the community.
Yeah, this is before you jump to the next slide,
Sure.
Seana, just super interesting that behavior training and consultations were cited as most needed, but they weren't the most used. Just super interesting data.
Yeah, and then even if you go back to this one, what they would the two behavior options were seen as the most helpful, by the largest number of people in our sample. So, behavior is really coming through here as a strong need as well as financial. There's a gap there, not being offered as much. Yeah. All right. So we also asked about what future programming the organization would be implementing in the next 12 or 24 months. Again, this was from back 2015-16, but you can see again, behavior was a top choice. So very top of mind here, a lot of interest in implementing these programs. And then it just, there weren't a lot of big differences here. They kind of slid down a little bit, but so, somewhere between a third to not quite a half we're planning additional future programming. All right, so all of that, we started to feel like, what's the story here? With only maybe like 4 questions, we started to feel like, oh, we're pulling together some pieces here. Can we weave this together? What can we really, what can we really learn from all of this information? So this graph is just like one attempt at this, where we plotted on the left side the reasons our participants saw that contributed to dog relinquishment. And then on the right side, what programs organizations were offering, what they planned to offer, and what they thought would most help. So, for example, if we look at financial reasons for surrender, basically any program that touches on finances, on cost, should have an impact on that. So if we look at food banks, for example, which were the most frequently offered, and was seen as some of the one of the more helpful programs, that should have an impact on financial reasons. Certainly free or low cost spay neuter, free or low cost veterinary care, and a veterinary fund. So these 3, those should have a big impact. If you can offer those to your community, those should have a big impact on financial reasons for surrender. And interestingly, this fund versus offering, so it's a charity fund that owners might be able to access, or that you gift to owners, and they can receive veterinary care anywhere. So that's a definitely, it's expensive, but it's fewer resources, because you don't have to actually provide the services yourself. That's interesting that participants saw that would be one of the most helpful programs, just as much as free or low cost vet services offered by their own organization. And then you see here behavior. If you map behavior, we have the behavior training classes, right? Like fewer organizations or consultations, fewer organizations offer those, but they were seen as some of the most helpful. And so you can map that onto that. One of the things I find really interesting about this chart is this moving, right? Moving and landlord being strongly contributing to dog relinquishments. And yet when you look across these programs and resources offered, what addresses those? I mean, I guess advice on the organization's website might, and surrender counseling might, rehoming advice might, but like it's harder to map that directly. So that makes me wonder, is there a gap here and something we can do to better directly support relinquishments that might be caused or influenced by moving? So we thought that was pretty interesting. So we did ask about what challenges they had running their program and limitations. So I grouped these into these categories. I mean, a big one is finances and resources. We're not working in the most cash flowing industry. So a lack of funds influences everything we do. And that's to run existing programs, develop future programs, add personnel to expand programs. It also affects equipment or renting the right space for something. So that certainly threads through everything and was probably the number one limitation our participants mentioned. Personnel, finding the right personnel, staff and volunteers, both was something that came up, and our participants particularly called out finding people with behavior experience, knowledge and experience to help with those behavior programs. Space came up, especially related to dog training classes. They wanted to offer dog training classes, but they couldn't find the right space, or they couldn't afford the right space. Sometimes there were also restrictions from landlords when they were renting property and locations. There were restrictions on what they could do with that space. There were legal and policy restrictions, and that was particularly related to wanting to offer veterinary services. One thing that I found really interesting that participants mentioned and seemed really frustrated by was the lack of awareness of their existing programs or the lack of use of them. And they mentioned it wasn't just the dog owners in the community who weren't aware of these programs, but even sometimes their own staff and volunteers didn't know. So there were programs the shelter or rescue was running that could help dog owners, but because staff and volunteers didn't know about them, they weren't offered to the dog owners, and a surrender happened. And so our participants were really frustrated with that. And I thought that was a really important point. And in fact, there's been some past research that looked at this and found that if owners had known about some of those resources, they might have taken advantage of those. And in one study by Emily Dolan and colleagues, 81% of owners at one shelter who were surrendering their pet didn't know about some of the resources the shelter offered. And when they were told about those resources, 88% of those owners opted to explore that help and kept the animal that day. We don't know what happened down the road, but still, that's a pretty amazing number that 88% of them, when they found out about those resources, said, hey, let me look into that. Let me see if that will help this situation, and didn't surrender their pet that day. So that our finding here really echoed these other research studies, findings in these other research studies. Timing was an issue. Again, sometimes the access to the access to the program, or when the delivery of the program support came, was too late to help the owners. Maybe they were already too far down the path. They'd already made this decision. And something that also came through from the open-ended responses from our participants was the lack of a holistic community approach, that they often felt like people were just reinventing the wheel, that they were spinning wheels, and that there wasn't a wide enough coordinated effort across all agencies in a community to better support pet ownership in the community. And that's something I know in sheltering we have been talking about a lot lately, and that comes up a lot still. I think things are getting better, but it's something to keep on the radar. All right. So I wanted to ask you all, this was a little bit of a whirlwind tour, I know, but based on what you heard today, what limitations do you see in the study results or findings? What might limit the generalizability, the accuracy, or usefulness of the study results? So you can put that into chat and we will take a look, and I'll just call out some of those, and then I'll share some of what we thought were limitations. Right, Connie, like the pandemic disrupted everything, and we know it disrupted sheltering, adoptions, pet ownership. What does this look like now? What are the needs now? So yes, responses right. We only ask the sheltering. We only have the sheltering perspective here. We don't know. Yep, sample size. Yep, demographics. Right, we don't have the exact intake numbers. Oh, you guys are like, because every study has limitations. There are no perfect studies. I have not seen any yet. So totally there are limitations. So yeah. Yeah, we didn't ask anything about dog breeds, so because we don't have numbers. Yep. Awesome. All right, so I'll share with you what we saw. Thank you, everybody. So certainly the sample size was 111. There's no way 111 organizations can represent all sheltering organizations across the US. There are just going to be limitations there. And so that limits the representativeness, but it also limited our ability to make comparisons, particularly by region and by organization type. We really were interested in those regional trends, and oftentimes we were not finding statistically significant differences. Now, maybe because sometimes there weren't, but sometimes we really thought there were, and we just didn't have enough sample size. We didn't have the power to detect those differences. So future research needs a lot larger, a lot larger number and more diverse. The sampling method, we went to we used an online survey. It went out in Humane Society newsletter, Pet Point, but what about all those places using Chameleon or Shelter Buddy or something else? What organizations were left out that never even had the chance to participate if they wanted to? That also limits our representativeness. Also, there's a bit of a self-selection bias when people saw the title and the description of the study about community programs to support pet ownership. If they didn't have any programs, they probably were like, nope, not for me. Or maybe if they didn't feel good about those programs and think they were the right programs, or maybe their programs were getting reorganized, maybe they didn't participate. So all of that would limit the representativeness. Of course, we mentioned age of the data. What would these results look like now? We don't really know. I'm not aware of any recent studies that asked this question and surveyed sheltering organizations in the US about this. So we really need to redo this study to get a feel for what's happening now, what's working now, what's not working now. It was dogs only because we are Center for Shelter Dogs, Collaborative for Shelter Dogs. We're focused on dogs, but cats do get surrendered. What does that look like for them? Other animals get surrendered. What does it look like for them? Again, all the organizations had to accept dog surrenders, but some organizations offer support for pet owners but don't accept surrenders. So we missed them entirely. And we did not collect any shelter data. This is a result of perceptions and opinions. And while I think that's probably a good first step to getting a feel for this. It's a lot more burdensome to ask for all that shelter data, but and Shelter Animals Count is making strides and looking at community programming and the number of animals touched by different programs. It is definitely more burdensome to collect that information versus kind of this gut check. Still, we're human, we're susceptible to influences of memory and saliency and what recently happened or what we think happened. And so may not be the most accurate information. And really importantly, this was only a shelter perspective. We didn't get any input from these same communities, from the pet owners or other people in the community. So that's so important. Again, this was a first pass, but we're missing a very, very key piece to understanding the whole picture there. All right, so given all that, I still think it was worthwhile doing. I still think there are things to learn from these results as well as the process of asking these questions. So again, I want to ask you all, whirlwind tour here, but what struck you as a key takeaway or how you might use these findings? And it's okay to say, I'm not sure I would, so that's okay. I won't take that personally. Yeah, seeing the need versus the actual use. Behavior came out as a clear thread through all of this as a need for more behavior resources. Yeah, housing resources, that came out as a big factor for contributing to relinquishments, and yet hard to find the direct information or resources to help with that. Communities' challenges as a whole, yeah. Yes. Yeah, and anything related to vet care and spay neuter and financial resources, affording veterinary care, big factor. Yeah. All right, thank you. So and feel free to put more in there. That really appreciate that. Thank you. So for us, yes, one key takeaway was most organizations in our sample anyway offered programming to reduce dog relinquishments and support ownership. So that's huge, right? We're trying to do something in our field. We're trying to help get into the community and help owners care for their animals and keep their animals in their home when they can. But owners and even staff and volunteers aren't always aware of the programs or don't always use them. So that's a huge area to work on, is to make sure that your community, as well as your staff and volunteers, know about the programs, changes to the programs, availability, eligibility for the programs. And then if they're not being used, get track some metrics on usage. If they're not being used, that's time to step back and say why. If you have a food bank and you're publicizing it, but hardly anyone's coming and using the food bank, you have a lot of food that's expiring that you now have to throw out. And that's a big question of why. Don't keep doing it. Check out. Maybe somebody else down the road is suddenly got some other program that they're able to meet most of those needs or something. So it's a question. And then some of the programs are not always aligned with the reasons for relinquishment or what's perceived to be the most impactful program. So again, taking that step back and saying, what does the community need? What are we offering? Are these things aligned? If not, where are the gaps? What can we do about it? Is that something we can do about it? Somebody else can do? We can partner with somebody? Where do we go from here? High resource programs, costly programs like vet care, vet services, behavioral services could have large impact. So the payoff could be great, but the costs are high. So that's something to think about. How is it up to every organization to offer that? Or again, maybe it's a partnering. Maybe there's someone down the road or in the community who's doing a great job with that. And instead you can partner and not rebuild from scratch. Financial and resource limitations obviously restrict the programs. And so you have to make strategic decisions about which programs to implement, to run, and to offer. We can't do it all. We just can't. So what's the greatest need in your community, and how do you best meet that need? And there's going to be differences, you have to look at each individual community. There are going to be differences across regions and by species, and it's going to vary. So this is one of those things where it's definitely not a one size fits all kind of situation. So I think this is comes back to thinking creatively. There's probably potential to develop some pretty innovative programs, but maybe they're not solving everything. They're just solving a slice of what's happening, because that's the best we can do at the time. But there may be ways to build those high impact programs, but maybe it's a partnering or only offering certain services, not all services. So, and certainly assessing and understanding the community, getting input directly from the community is essential. And then an obstacle or a barrier to successful programs is a lack of regular assessment, like going back and revisiting. Just because something worked once 20 years ago, or something worked 20 years ago, doesn't mean that same program is working now. So always constantly assessing the community's need, the services you're offering, and the services, their usage and their success. What are their outcomes? All right, and we need more research on this. We need more research what's in existence. We need more program evaluation research, what's working, and we need to get that information out to organizations and folks like you guys so that you have that information and evidence-based information to help you make those decisions at your organization. So this really prompted a whole area for me, this study, where I have been really interested in this topic and these programs. And Dr. Erin Doyle had invited me to be a co-author with her on a chapter on safety net programs in the second edition of the Shelter Behavior Handbook, which was a really great experience. And through that, we came to this idea of strategic alignment, strategic decision making. So I'm not going to walk through all these slides, but I wanted to share, and I have given a talk. It's a couple talks on this, but one from a couple years ago is recorded on the Maddie's University. It was at Cornell 2022 ASPCA Maddie's Cornell Shelter Medicine Conference. But it's basically this process of gathering information and making decisions, understanding your community and the landscape, identifying their needs, figuring out the program structure, impact outcome metrics, what are the required resources, and then making decisions. Like you can use a matrix like this, strategic decision-making matrix, but basically looking at what's it going to take to run this program versus the impact and need in my community. So, some programs might be low impact but low cost. Maybe and some might be high. So I don't have examples there, but like maybe this one low requirement or high impact, right? Like you can make a matrix for your community and for your organization and think about things strategically, plotting the need and the resources with the program. So I'm not going to go through all these, but I wanted to include them. I'm sorry, there's so many clicks there. To review later, to kind of add just this element of a little bit more strategic decision making. And for me, that was one of the major takeaways from this study, was not just the findings themselves, but the process of asking these questions and thinking about what's needed. Okay.
All right. Thank you so much, Seana. This was super interesting. Let's go ahead and jump into questions. The first question is, could it be possible that moving could mean moving to another location may ultimately be inability to find housing for the pet and lack of pet inclusive housing?
Yeah, definitely. We're our own experiences as well as the research out there, especially qualitative interview research, suggests that moving is sort of a catch-all reason, and there's actually a lot of sub-reasons in there, like transporting across the country, or moving, my cat's not going to tolerate 10 days in the car, or moving, I can't find housing that would allow me to take of this size. So there's a lot of components to that moving for sure. And I would suggest any organization looking at their relinquishment reasons, when you see that, thank you. When you see that moving, to go back and try to dig into that a little more, ask a few more questions to get a better feel for what's happening in your community.
Awesome. Thank you. I have a question that ties in, that is carried over from some of the chat entries about limitations. With regard to limitations, someone mentioned the importance of looking at the impact of program offerings and whether they actually work. But
Yes.
efficacy can be really challenging to demonstrate. What are your thoughts about types of data that organizations should collect that help them to determine whether a program to prevent intake is actually working?
Yeah. So, I mean, a key one is always usage, like who's using it. And it's not just numbers, but some information about the owner, information about the pets. But that may or may not tell you how effective it is. It's not just about who's using it. So then you want to go back to, why did you develop that program in the first place? What's the impact you want to have? Set that as a measurable goal, and then you're looking, like maybe you need to look at your shelter data annually to see what are our trends in surrenders, and are the numbers changing at all. Maybe you need to do interviews or surveys. Maybe you got to go out to human health agencies and ask them for some information. So there are a lot of different ways that you can try to get at the question of whether your programs are helping reduce surrenders, because it is tricky to just look at your straight numbers, your shelter numbers. I think you have to start there, but that's not the only way to understand the impact of your programs. Talking to your community, talking to pet owners, talking to people who are using the program. I mean, maybe they're there using it, but they're like, or maybe they're super excited and they can see the direct impact and they're telling you that. So it's probably a handful of metrics that you need.
Thank you. And so the next question kind of ties into all of that and something that you talked about, and that is getting programs into the hands of the people who actually need them, because you might offer something, but is it being used by the people that you're really trying to reach?
Yeah.
Thoughts and suggestions about that?
Yeah. So again, I think this goes back to knowing your community and being connected and engaged with your community. Putting up information on your social media program is helpful. Sure, do that. But then it's taking the extra steps to actually make sure it's connecting with the people you most are trying to reach. So maybe they're not on social media or they don't follow you. They maybe don't even know you're in the community, or they don't know you take pets, or they don't know you have this program. So where do you go? Well, where are those people going? Are they going to pet food stores? Are they going to the grocery store? Are they going to veterinarians or the low cost vaccination clinic in your community? Are they, can you get into housing areas? Can you get into community centers? And creating and building those partnerships, finding those kind of community leaders who can help spread the word for you, offering something like a free behavior training, a 2-hour session with snacks in the middle at the community center, and getting those folks in and then getting them excited and have them spread the word. So it is some groundwork, but our legwork. But if you can get people engaged and excited, then you can get them to help you spread the word.
Thank you. Super helpful. Last question, unless something else comes in, is related to this issue of moving. I feel like that's something that people get a ton of hate for attempting to do when they're moving. I'm on lots of Facebook groups, regional, about people who are moving and trying to rehome their pets, and people just get hate, hate, hate. But the reality of our lives is that many times people don't choose to move. They have to move for work, and it's not easy to find rental housing, as it's been mentioned. Not to mention, moving is really expensive, especially if you don't have much money to begin with. This is one of those topics that keeps me up late at night thinking about, as someone who is a frequent renter. And I'm really interested whether you've learned about any programs that are really good to help people keep their pets when they move. I know some of it's got to be related to finding that rental housing, but some of it is just the money that it costs
Mhm.
to move.
Yeah. Yeah. I'm not aware of like any kind of more widely known, like maybe funds for that or to tap into that. But I think that's a huge, that's a huge need and a big area that could be developed. I also wonder if there's a way to create a platform to connect people with other people who have done it or would support it. Sometimes if people are moving for a job or for a family situation, are there people connected to that workplace who would help? I'm also thinking like, how we're developing more resources to help people who are rehoming their pets to help direct to rehome and avoiding the shelter. Like, are there platforms we could develop to help people with moving and understanding logistics and how to make it less stressful for the pet? Realistic costs. What about stops along the way? I know I have friends who brought horses across country and they got connected to a barn here and a barn here and a barn here. And they would like literally people would offer up their barn for somebody's horse overnight. Like, is there something we could do with that for pets, companion animal pets?
That's super, super interesting. I really appreciate your thoughts there. We have one other question. It's aside from putting resources and pet retention information on the organization's website, what are other ways to get the information into the community to help owners before they are at the point of wanting to surrender? Community events, flyers,
Yeah.
what can we do?
Yeah. So, I mean, I think the point there is the earlier we can get it out to owners, the better our chances of a successful outcome. Because time and time again, our experience and research shows that after people have traveled through that agonizing decision-making process and have decided to surrender and they get to the shelter and they find out there's a resource, it's really hard to unwind that decision. So the earlier we can get that information out, the better. And again, I think it's back to, yeah, put it on social media and put it on social media a lot. Fine. Do it in different campaigns, try to target it different places, but also, mailers, flyers, getting to the pet store. I mean, people are buying pet food or they're going to your food bank for pet food. Like get it there, get it to them there. The veterinarians, free, low cost spay neuter clinics, vet care, but also human. Think One Health, human clinics that are serving some populations. Get it out to them, partner, get it out to social service agencies, the grocery store, the community center. I think it's a multi-pronged approach. Sure, online advertising, your posting is important, but also where are people going? Get it there physically. Maybe it's sometimes, the fair, the local county fair, a health fair, something like that. So it's, and this is where you want to go talk to your community. Ask the people who maybe would be using this program. Where would they find it? How could this reach them? It's so important to get that direct from your community. That will help you figure out and target focused efforts to reach out.
Great. Thank you so much. And just some discussion in the chat about Section 8 rules against having pets and people not being able to afford pet deposits and rental owners who don't want pets to do damage, which are all things that are part of this big issue.
Definitely.
I put a link in the chat for petsandhousing.org, which is the Michelson Foundation's pet inclusive housing website that I encourage everyone to look at. It looks like we have one last question. How can we reach landlords to get them to start to let people in their rentals?
Yeah, I don't have the answer for that, but it's a big topic of conversation. And I mean, I'm glad we're talking about it. We need to be talking about this and we have to move this needle. And it's not going to be one solution. We have to do it policy. We have to do it city ordinances. We have to do it with insurance. We have to convince the landlords themselves. We got to collect more data. So this is an ongoing effort to push the envelope. But sometimes you can do it on a one-by-one basis. Sometimes it's convincing a landlord to look at their numbers. Like if they just had one person who destroyed the apartment and they had spent thousands of dollars to clean it up, they are not going to be in favor of renting to anyone with a pet again. But if you can make that, connection and figure out ways to reassure them or help them or provide some cushion there, that could do a lot to change a mind. It's only one person, but that could be a place to start too. Sometimes having a gathering or a meeting of landlords, and I know we're over, sorry, but having them come together and talk, create a community forum, a coffee chat where they could talk and connect and hear resources, maybe making them allies instead of enemies can help.
Thank you so much, Shauna. Really interesting conversation. And thank you to all of you for watching today's webcast. Shauna will be available on Maddie's Pet Forum to continue the discussion. Feel free to post more questions there.
Yes, thanks, everyone. Really appreciate the comments and questions.
Thanks, Shauna. And thank you all. And we'll see you next time.